I want to move right to Alison Collins. She is an educator and former San Francisco Board of Education commissioner. Alison, along with three other board members, all educators of color, were recalled after a campaign supported by San Francisco Democratic Mayor London Bree herself, a Black woman. Three parents replaced them, backed by Bree. Ooh, we're jumping into the deep end. First of all, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all.
Absolutely. What brought my attention to your work was the fact that you are part of the victims of this push against critical race theory, against just the school boards in general. Like, it's not just critical race theory. There seems to be an onslaught across the country against school boards. Would you talk about that in general, but specifically how it impacted you?
Well, I guess I appreciate you bringing it up. And I think what has been interesting as somebody in San Francisco, we do have a sense, we always like to think of ourselves as really unique. We are a very progressive school district. We've, for a long time, pushed progressive policies. We've removed police from schools. We've had pro-LGBTQ curriculum. And so a lot of times we think of ourselves as separate from the country. And yet what we've been seeing is attacks against educators at the school board level, but all the way down to the classroom level. And I've been following this on Twitter. I'm very connected with educators who do anti-racist education across the country. And there's basically just a purging of our education system from the top to the bottom. And they're using critical race theory and information attacks, recalls, and also resignation campaigns to just purge the system and bring us back. And so in San Francisco specifically, we started seeing a lot of activity around reopening schools. And I've also seen it kind of a confluence. I don't think this would be happening if it weren't for COVID. I think it was very destabilizing. And what you saw in New York and San Francisco was a wave of parents who said, we want our kids back in school. And there were discrepancies in who wanted their kids back sooner. And the Republican Party and conservative and right-wing forces basically mobilized that parent frustration and parent anger, which was largely affluent, white, parents or professional women as well, who maybe were less impacted by COVID and needed schools to be open in order for them to work. As compared to, we have a lot of communities of color in San Francisco that live in multi-generational households. Were actually more impacted by COVID, less able to quarantine, when you're living a whole family in a one-bedroom house. And so school districts were balancing these needs, especially in urban areas like New York, San Francisco, and basically, I'd say more conservative forces were able to mobilize that parent frustration and anger in conjunction with other efforts to kind of push back on progressive anti-racist education and just, mobilize people to remove folks from office.
Can you help us understand why it is that so many conservative groups, movements, politicians, why is a school board level so important that they are throwing everything but the book at it?
That's a really good question. Yeah, and I don't think people understand. I'm an educator, 100%. I'm a parent organizer. I ran because I've been working in our district for a very long time as just a parent, and I wanted to be involved at that level. But for most people in San Francisco, the school board is seen as a stepping stone to higher office, and that's true across the country. And so if you want the pathway to power, it's through these local offices. And we're not just seeing school boards, but we're also seeing other local offices that are being targeted. But it's very, kids are a very emotional issue. And if you can mobilize parents, you can mobilize folks and in a very strong way politically. And that's where schools have consistently been a way for people to mobilize for political action, even when, the ultimate goal isn't necessarily to serve schools. And we've seen that, right? public schools are generally underfunded, undersupported, and yet they consistently come up in political campaigns because they mobilize people to vote. And specifically around safety of children, it's a very mobilizing issue to talk about, child safety when it comes to COVID, also when it comes to some of these issues that conservative parents are concerned about when it comes to teaching about LGBTQ issues, teaching about sex education, or teaching about race.
You have a podcast, and it is entitled Just Talks. I'm one of your first episode. You were talking with Dr. Walter Greason. You connected these attacks to on the school board to January 6th. Help us see that connection there.
Well, I think it's, I do appreciate that because this isn't a new thing. We've seen this throughout history. And last January, when this recall started, I started seeing things happening across the country. And so then you start to realize this isn't just San Francisco. And then when I talked to educators who, and especially historians, I became really appreciative of historians. They started talking about the fact that McCarthyism actually started with school boards. And I didn't realize that. But they basically branded people communists, and they went from town to town and said, these people can't teach our children, they're communists. And so this is a playbook, and, I spoke to Jesse Hagopian. He's with the Zinn Education Project, and they're tracking anti-CRT legislation and trying to support educators in the classroom who are being targeted. There's like social studies teachers, kids are filming them and then sending it to Fox News, and they're getting fired. So this is not just a school board issue, and these are all connected. And if it's just a playbook. But what's challenging, I think, is that we have social media, which allows people to really amplify misinformation in a way that is unprecedented. And also, like I said, we've had progress, but, places like maybe New York or San Francisco or quote blue states don't realize that, these same playbooks are just as effective.
No, I'm thinking, and as you add it up, from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, to the South, to the North, we see this concerted effort by conservatives to control from the school board level. I want to briefly talk about the recall campaign that you faced, because all of this is interconnected, but more specifically, what's the next move, not only for you, but for other parents and educators who get involved only to be recalled by a movement that's trying to stop you from teaching our kids?
Yeah, I think that to me has been the biggest concern is thinking about, I was an organizer on the ground. And what I realized is once I became a member of the school board, you need folks to protect you and the work in order for you to keep doing it. And we are really dealing with a very organized infrastructure that's been built to basically take back our country to the 40s and 50s as far as, some of the policies that we have. And in doing the research, I'm an educator and I do research. I met with a professor, Isaac Kamala, and he has basically documented this infrastructure has been in place for a while now, but it was targeted on higher ed. So the colleges were facing this through Koch-funded organizations called Campus Reform, was like a way that they would publish fake news. And then they had training organizations or student leadership for conservative college students to basically launch information campaigns against educators at the higher ed level, talking about critical race theory, and remove them from our colleges. And that he's basically saying that infrastructure is now being focused on the K through 12 level. And I'm seeing it with an organization like Charlie Kirk has an organization called Turning Point. San Francisco Unified is on that list, right? So they list school boards that are doing like critical race theory. There's organizations like Parents Defending Education. Azra Nomani is very politically active. She's a Trump supporter, right-wing media persona, and she's a parent who also started a group where parents can report their school district for teaching CRT. So there's an infrastructure that I don't think people are really aware of. It's heavily funded, and it is highly connected, both politically and also with the media. And so the reason I started the podcast is because I feel like people are really unprepared. I mean, I'm just a volunteer. I'm not a professional politician. I don't have a PR firm. And when you look at even smaller, school districts, if they want to take you out, they have an infrastructure to do that. And I think this really is just a test case for what they are planning to do across the country in the November elections.
That's Alison. That's the part. As much as this is completely an aside, but what you said just really made me reflect on why we do what we do here, because I think a lot of people don't realize there's an actual coup happening right now in real time. It might be moving slow, but they're not done yet. And the school board level is a part of that. Alison, can you tell everyone how they can get up with you and support your work, and just get a last thought on that for me?
Well, I appreciate that. So I'm Allie M. Collins on Twitter, and I also started Allie Collins Productions on Facebook and Instagram. I'll be sharing podcasts, but my goal is to really bring some of the folks that I've told you about to the public so they can get educated about what's happening. And I just deeply appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And media like this is really important because mainstream media is not covering this story. And it is critical right now with all that's going on in the world. We also need to be aware that there's a war kind of happening on the ground. And there's folks who are using this kind of destabilizing time with COVID and the war in Ukraine to make moves at a local level. This is a communications war. And I don't think people understand how much of a communications war this is. And I talk to folks, in the city, and they say, oh, well, I'm not on Twitter. And I say, yeah, but folks are talking about stuff that is going to make things, it's going to be real life. People are generating fake news that becomes real, and we have to deal with it. So media is important. We have to be media savvy, and we have to spread the truth. And your show and other shows are the ones that are getting the truth out.
Alison Collins, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us.